The wind howled with savage fury as it tore through the mountain pass, carrying with it a torrent of icy rain that battered the solitary cabin, perched precariously on the edge of the Colorado wilderness. Abigail Blackwell clutched her woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders, watching with dismay as the last of her candles flickered weakly against the growing darkness. Outside, the storm of 1878 raged with an intensity that made the timber walls of her home groan in protest. When she had decided to claim her late uncle's cabin after fleeing the suffocating confines of Boston society, no one had warned her about the ferocity of western storms. The last 3 months had been a lesson in survival, each day bringing new challenges that the 22-year-old had faced with stubborn determination. But tonight, as the wind found every crack and crevice to send chilling drafts through the cabin, Abigail felt her resolve wavering. The candle sputtered once more before the flame was extinguished, plunging the room into darkness save for the occasional flash of lightning that illuminated her sparse furnishings. Abigail fumbled for the matchbox on the small wooden table, her heart sinking when her fingers found only an empty container. "Not now," she whispered, the sound of her voice swallowed by another crash of thunder. A sharp knock at the door made her gasp, the sound almost indistinguishable from the constant barrage of the storm. Abigail froze, her mind racing. No one in their right mind would be out in such weather, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. The knock came again, more insistent this time. Abigail reached for the shotgun propped beside the door, another inheritance from her uncle that she had quickly learned to use. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice stronger than she felt. "Madam, I don't mean to intrude," came a deep voice from the other side of the door. "Name's Gabriel Lawson. My horse threw a shoe about a mile back and I spotted your light before it went out. I'm just looking for shelter until this storm passes." Abigail hesitated, the shotgun steady in her hands. "How do I know you're telling the truth?" A pause, then. "You don't, madam. But I give you my word I mean no harm. I'm just a cowboy caught in a bad spot, same as you seem to be." Something in his voice, a note of honesty, perhaps made Abigail lower the shotgun slightly. With the storm raging and her candle extinguished, she was in a precarious position herself. Decision made, she slid back the bolt and opened the door just enough to see the stranger. Lightning flashed, illuminating a tall figure drenched to the bone. Water ran in rivulets from the brim of his hat, and despite the downpour, Abigail could make out strong features, a square jaw darkened with stubble, and eyes that seemed to reflect the storm's intensity. "Your candle went out in the storm," he observed, glancing past her to the darkened cabin. "Yes," Abigail admitted reluctantly. The man Gabriel offered a slight smile that somehow warmed his weather-beaten face. "I'll stay until morning comes if you'll allow it. I've got dry matches and can help get that fire built up proper." Abigail weighed her options quickly. The night stretched long and cold ahead, and this stranger, dangerous as he might be, offered light and warmth. "Very well, Mr. Lawson," she said finally, stepping back from the door. "But know that I can use this." She gestured with the shotgun for emphasis. Gabriel nodded respectfully as he entered, removing his dripping hat. "Wouldn't expect any less from a lady living alone out here." As he moved into the light cast by the flickering fireplace embers, Abigail noticed he carried saddlebags over one shoulder. His movements were measured, careful, like he was trying not to frighten her. "Been out here long?" he asked conversationally, kneeling by the fireplace to coax the dying embers back to life. 3 months, Abigail replied, keeping a safe distance. "The cabin belonged to my uncle." Gabriel nodded, not pressing further as he skillfully built up the fire. Within minutes, golden light spilled across the cabin floor, chasing away the worst of the shadows. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small tin of matches, then moved to the table where Abigail's extinguished candle sat. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the candle. At her nod, he struck a match and relit the wick, the small flame dancing to life once more. For the first time, Abigail got a clear look at her unexpected visitor. Despite his rain-soaked appearance, there was something steady about Gabriel Lawson, something reliable in the way he moved with quiet confidence. "Thank you," she said, lowering the shotgun slightly but keeping it within reach. "No need for thanks," he replied, settling his saddlebags by the door. "Any decent person would do the same." Abigail wasn't so sure about that. In her experience, decent people were far rarer than those who would take advantage, especially out here in the untamed West. But as the cabin gradually warmed and Gabriel kept a respectful distance, she felt her initial fear begin to subside. "Are you hungry, Mr. Lawson? I don't have much, but there's some stew left from dinner." Gabriel's eyes lit up at the mention of food. "That's mighty kind of you, Miss Blackwell. Abigail Blackwell, Miss Blackwell. And yes, I wouldn't turn down a hot meal if you're offering." Abigail moved to the small stove, grateful for something to do. As she ladled the remaining venison stew into a bowl, she watched Gabriel from the corner of her eye. He had removed his soaked coat and hung it near the fire, revealing a simple cotton shirt that clung to broad shoulders. A gun belt hung low on his hips, but he made no move toward the weapon. "What brings you to these parts, Mr. Lawson?" she asked, passing him the steaming bowl. Gabriel accepted it with a grateful nod. "I'm heading to Silverton. Got word of work with a cattle outfit there." He took a spoonful of stew, appreciation evident on his face. "This is mighty fine, Miss Blackwell." "Abigail, please," she found herself saying, surprising herself with the informality. "Gabe, then," he responded with a small smile. "Most folks don't stand on ceremony with me." The storm continued its assault on the cabin, but inside the atmosphere had shifted. As Gabriel ate, Abigail found herself telling him about Boston, about her uncle's unexpected bequest of the cabin, and her decision to leave behind a life that had felt increasingly restrictive after her parents' death. "Wanted freedom, did you?" Gabe asked perceptively. Abigail nodded. "I wanted to make my own choices for once, even if they were difficult ones." "Coming out here alone certainly qualifies as difficult," he observed, setting aside his empty bowl. "Takes courage, or foolishness," Abigail countered, a rueful smile tugging at her lips. "There are days I'm not sure which it is." Gabe's laugh was warm and genuine. "In my experience, Miss Abigail, the line between courage and foolishness is mighty thin. The trick is surviving long enough to look back and decide which it was." As the night deepened, they fell into easy conversation. Gabe told her of growing up on a small Texas ranch, of joining a cattle drive at 17, and the years since spent following work across the Western Territories. His stories painted vivid pictures of vast landscapes and frontier towns, of the characters he'd met and the adventures he'd had. "What about family?" Abigail asked as she added another log to the fire. "Do you have anyone waiting for you in Silverton?" A shadow crossed Gabe's face. "No family to speak of. Lost my pa to fever when I was 14. Ma followed a few years later, been on my own since." The simple statement held a depth of loneliness that resonated with Abigail's own. "I understand that feeling," she said quietly. Their eyes met across the firelight, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition of kindred spirits, perhaps, or simply the comfort of finding understanding in an unexpected place. The storm's fury began to abate as midnight approached. Rain still fell steadily, but the thunder had moved on, rumbling distantly over the mountains. Abigail stifled a yawn, the events of the day catching up with her. "You should rest," Gabe said, noticing her fatigue. "I'll keep watch by the fire." Abigail hesitated. Despite the ease that had developed between them, she was still a woman alone with a stranger. Reading her thoughts, Gabe added, "You have my word, Miss Abigail. I'll be right here in this chair when morning comes." Something in his steady gaze convinced her. "Very well. Thank you, Gabe." She retreated to the small bedroom, separated from the main room by a patchwork curtain, the shotgun still within reach. As she lay in her narrow bed listening to the rain, Abigail found herself thinking of the unexpected visitor and the strange twist of fate that had brought him to her door on this stormy night. Morning arrived with a gentle persistence, sunlight filtering through the cabin's single window. Abigail woke to the scent of coffee and the quiet sounds of movement in the main room. For a moment, she lay still, remembering the events of the night before. When she emerged from behind the curtain, fully dressed but with her hair still loose around her shoulders, she found Gabe tending to the stove. He looked up at her entrance, a smile warming his features. "Hope you don't mind," he said, gesturing to the coffee pot. "Thought you might appreciate a hot cup after last night's excitement." "Not at all," Abigail replied, somewhat surprised to find she was genuinely pleased to see him in the morning light. Without the storm's drama, she could better appreciate his tall frame and the way sunlight caught in his dark blonde hair. "Storms passed," he continued, pouring coffee into 2 tin cups. "Skies clear as crystal this morning." Abigail moved to the window, looking out at the transformed landscape. The storm had left everything washed clean, the pine trees glistening with raindrops in the early light. "It's beautiful," she murmured, accepting the coffee he offered. Their fingers brushed briefly in the exchange, a small contact that sent an unexpected warmth through her. "Thank you," she added after taking a sip, "for staying, for the matches and the company." Gabe inclined his head slightly. "It was my pleasure, Miss Abigail." They shared a simple breakfast of cornbread and the last of Abigail's preserved peaches. The conversation flowed as easily as it had the night before, and Abigail found herself reluctant to see it end, though she knew it must. "I should be on my way," Gabe said finally, rising from the table. "Need to see about my horse and make up some lost time." "Of course," Abigail agreed, ignoring the pang of disappointment she felt. "Silverton isn't getting any closer while you sit here." Gabe gathered his things, now dried by the fire, and shrugged into his coat. At the door he hesitated, hat in hand. "Miss Abigail, He began, then stopped, seeming to reconsider his words. "Thank you for your hospitality. Not everyone would take in a stranger during a storm." "Not everyone would offer to stay until morning comes," she countered softly. Something flickered in his eyes, a question perhaps, or a possibility neither of them was ready to voice. With a tip of his hat, he was gone, striding down the muddy path toward where he had left his horse the night before. Abigail watched him go, standing in the doorway until his figure disappeared among the trees. Only then did she return to the cabin, which somehow seemed emptier than it had before his arrival. The day passed slowly as Abigail went about her usual tasks, gathering eggs from her small henhouse, tending her garden, and mending a tear in her only good dress. But her thoughts kept returning to the cowboy with the gentle eyes and the stories that had made her lonely cabin feel, for one night, like somewhere she belonged. She told herself it was foolish. Gabriel Lawson was likely halfway to Silverton by now, and soon he would be just another memory in a life that had already seen too many farewells. As evening approached, Abigail was startled by the sound of hoofbeats approaching the cabin. Heart racing, she reached for the shotgun before cautiously peering through the window. A familiar figure on horseback emerged from the trees, leading a second horse laden with supplies. Gabe dismounted with easy grace, approaching the cabin with his hat in his hands. "Mr. Lawson," Abigail said as she opened the door, unable to keep the surprise from her voice. "I thought you'd be well on your way to Silverton by now." Gabe shifted his weight, a gesture that hinted at uncharacteristic nervousness. "That was my intention, Miss Blackwell. But I got to thinking on my ride this morning." He glanced at the supplies on the pack horse. "I noticed you're running low on some necessities. Thought I might bring you a few things before continuing on. Candles included," he added with a slight smile, "in case another storm blows through." Abigail looked from Gabe to the supplies and back again, momentarily speechless at the thoughtful gesture. "You didn't have to do that," she said finally. "I know," he replied simply, "but I wanted to." There was more to it than just supplies, they both knew it. Something had begun the night before, something neither of them had expected but that now hung in the air between them, full of possibility. "Would you like to stay for dinner?" Abigail asked, the words coming before she could reconsider them. "To thank you for your kindness." The smile that spread across Gabe's face made her glad she had asked. "I'd be honored, Miss Abigail." As they unloaded the supplies together, flour and sugar, coffee and salt, ammunition for her shotgun, and a generous bundle of candles, Abigail found herself laughing more than she had in months. Gabe's presence brought an ease she hadn't realized she was missing, his quiet strength a complement to her own determined independence. Over a dinner of rabbit stew and fresh biscuits, Gabe confessed the real reason for his return. "Truth is, Miss Abigail, I couldn't stop thinking about you. About this place." His eyes held hers across the table. "It's been a long time since I've felt at home, anywhere. Last night, despite the storm and all, something about being here just felt right." Abigail's heart quickened at his words. "I felt it too," she admitted softly. "After you left this morning, the cabin seemed so empty." Gabe reached across the table, his rough hand covering hers gently. "I know we barely know each other, and I've still got to get to Silverton. Gave my word I'd be there, but I thought, perhaps, if you were willing, I could come back this way afterward." The hope in his eyes made Abigail's breath catch. "I would like that very much, Gabe." His smile at her words was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. They talked late into the evening, sharing stories and hopes, discovering the common threads that ran through their seemingly different lives: a love of freedom, a respect for the wild beauty of the frontier, and the loneliness that had shaped them both. When Gabe eventually rose to leave, promising to return as soon as his business in Silverton was concluded, Abigail walked with him to the door. There, in the soft glow of the newly lit candles, he paused, looking down at her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "May I write to you?" he asked. "While I'm away?" "I would be disappointed if you didn't," Abigail replied with a smile. Gabe's hand rose to gently touch her cheek, a gesture so tender it made her heart ache. "Until then, Miss Abigail Blackwell." Before he turned to go, he leaned down and pressed his lips to hers, a kiss as gentle as it was brief, a promise of more to come. In the weeks that followed, letters arrived regularly, carried by the occasional riders who passed through. Gabe wrote of his work with the cattle outfit, of the bustling silver mining town of Silverton, and, increasingly, of his plans for the future, plans that he hoped might include her. Abigail kept each letter, reading them in the evenings by candlelight, her responses growing more open and affectionate as their correspondence continued. She wrote of her daily life, the challenges and triumphs of managing on her own, and the dreams she had begun to nurture since his visit, dreams that no longer centered on solitary independence, but on the possibility of a shared life. Summer was fading toward autumn when Gabe finally returned, riding into the clearing one golden afternoon as Abigail hung laundry on the line. She saw him first as a distant figure, then recognized the familiar shape of his hat, the way he sat tall in the saddle. Dropping the damp shirt she had been about to hang, Abigail gathered her skirts and ran toward him, propriety forgotten in the joy of seeing him again. Gabe dismounted in one fluid motion and caught her as she reached him, lifting her off her feet in an embrace that spoke of all the longing of their separation. When he set her down, his hands remained at her waist, his eyes searching hers. "I've missed you something fierce, Abigail Blackwell." "And I you, Gabriel Lawson," she replied, her smile radiant. That evening, as they sat before the fire, Gabe shared his news. He had secured a position as foreman on a ranch just 20 miles from her cabin, close enough to visit regularly, far enough to maintain the independence they both valued. "It's good work with good people," he told her, his excitement evident. "The owner, Mr. Thompson, is getting on in years, looking for someone to take over more of the day-to-day running of things." "It sounds perfect for you," Abigail said, genuinely happy for him. Gabe nodded, his expression turning more serious. "There's something else, Abigail, something I've been thinking about since that first night." He reached for her hand, his touch warm and reassuring. "That storm brought me to your door, and I thank God every day for it. When your candle went out and I promised to stay until morning, I had no idea I'd be finding the light I'd been searching for my whole life." Abigail's eyes filled with tears at his words, her heart too full to speak. "I know it hasn't been long by most folks' reckoning," Gabe continued, his voice deepening with emotion. "But out here, time measures different. We live closer to the bone, see clearer what matters." He shifted, reaching into his pocket to withdraw a simple gold band. "I'm asking if you'd consider becoming my wife, Abigail. Not right away if you're not ready, but someday. I'm offering you my heart, my name, and every tomorrow I have left." Abigail looked from the ring to Gabe's face, seeing in his eyes all the hope and fear and love that she herself felt. In that moment, she knew with absolute certainty what her answer would be. "Yes," she whispered, her voice gaining strength as she repeated, "Yes, Gabriel Lawson, I will marry you." Joy transformed his features as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit, as though meant for her all along. "It was my mother's," he explained softly. "The only thing of hers I kept. She'd be mighty pleased to know it's yours now." Abigail touched the band reverently, honored by the significance of the gift. "I'll treasure it always, Gabe." Their engagement was brief by Eastern standards, but felt right to them both. They were married in late October in the small church in the nearest town, with only a handful of witnesses: the ranch owner Mr. Thompson and his wife, the local doctor who had befriended Abigail, and a few of Gabe's fellow cowboys from the ranch. Abigail wore her mother's ivory dress, carefully preserved and brought west in her trunk. Gabe stood tall in a new black suit, his usually tanned face slightly pale with nervousness, until the moment Abigail appeared at the church door. Then, his expression transformed into one of such profound joy that it brought tears to the eyes of Mrs. Thompson, who later declared it the most beautiful wedding she had ever attended. The decision to make their home at Abigail's cabin was a practical one. It stood on good land with access to water, and the nearby town was growing steadily as more settlers arrived. Gabe would ride to the Thompson ranch for his work, sometimes staying overnight during busy periods, but always returning to Abigail as soon as his duties allowed. Their first winter as husband and wife tested them in ways neither had anticipated. November brought early snows that lingered into December, making the trail between the cabin and the ranch treacherous. There were weeks when Gabe couldn't make the journey home, leaving Abigail to manage alone through blizzards that made her first Colorado winter seem mild by comparison. But the separation only strengthened their appreciation for the time they shared. When Gabe would finally make it home, their reunions were sweet beyond words, each discovering in the other the perfect balm for loneliness. By spring, they had settled into a rhythm that suited them both. Abigail expanded her garden, adding medicinal herbs she learned about from a book the doctor had lent her. Her knowledge of natural remedies spread through the scattered community, bringing occasional visitors seeking help for minor ailments. Gabe's position at the ranch grew more secure as Mr. Thompson came to rely on his judgment and work ethic. The older man began to speak openly of his intention to sell the ranch to Gabe when he and Mrs. Thompson decided to retire to California, where their daughter lived. "He's offered terms I could manage with time," Gabe told Abigail one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in gold and crimson. "We could build something real, something lasting." Abigail leaned against his shoulder, her hand resting protectively over the slight swell of her belly where their first child grew. "We already have, my love." Gabe's hand covered hers, his touch reverent. The news of the baby, shared just a week earlier, had left him alternating between stunned joy and nervous anticipation. "A family of our own," he said wonderingly. "Never thought I'd see the day." The summer passed in a haze of happiness and preparation. They added a second room to the cabin, Gabe working on it whenever he could spare time from the ranch. Abigail sewed tiny garments from flour sacks bleached white in the sun, embroidering delicate patterns along the edges. Their daughter, Grace Elizabeth Lawson, arrived on a crisp September morning with the assistance of Mrs. Thompson and the town doctor. Gabe, who had refused to leave despite both women's insistence that men had no place in the birthing room, had held Abigail's hand through every pain, his face a study in helpless devotion. When the first cry of their child filled the room, the look that passed between them held all the wonder of that stormy night, when they had first met, the recognition that something profound and unchangeable had occurred, altering the course of their lives forever. "She's perfect," Gabe whispered, cradling his daughter with hands that seemed suddenly too large and rough for such a delicate task. Just like her mother, life settled into a new pattern with Grace at its center. The baby thrived under the doting attention of her parents, growing from a tiny, red-faced newborn into a laughing infant with Abigail's dark curls and Gabe's bright blue eyes. The following spring brought two significant changes. Mr. Thompson, true to his word, began the process of transferring ownership of the ranch to Gabe, accepting a small down payment with the remainder to be paid over 10 years. And Abigail discovered she was expecting their second child. "We're blessed beyond measure," Gabe told her as they stood together on the porch one evening, Grace asleep in Abigail's arms. "Sometimes I wake in the night just to make sure it's all real, you Grace, this life we've built." Abigail understood the feeling. There were moments when the happiness seemed too perfect, too complete to be anything but a dream. But then Grace would cry, or Gabe would return mud splattered from the ranch, or the roof would leak during a heavy rain, the small, necessary imperfections that proved the reality of their joy. Their son, Samuel James Lawson, arrived in the winter of 1880, a sturdy boy with a lusty cry that made the doctor laugh approvingly. "He'll be as strong as his father," the old man predicted, clapping Gabe on the shoulder. With two small children and the ranch increasingly under Gabe's management as Mr. Thompson's health declined, they decided to make a change. The cabin, for all its sentimental value as the place where they had found each other, was becoming too small for their growing family. Additionally, The daily ride between the cabin and the ranch was taking valuable time away from both Gabe's work and his family. "There's a good house on the ranch property," Gabe told Abigail one evening as they discussed the situation. "The old foreman's place. It stood empty since he moved on last year. Thompson says we're welcome to it, if you're willing." Abigail considered the offer, her practical nature weighing the advantages against the emotional attachment she felt to the cabin. "Could we keep this place too?" she asked finally. "Not to live in, but it's where we began. I wouldn't want to lose it entirely." Gabe's smile was tender as he drew her close. "We'll keep it as a reminder, maybe use it in summers or when we need a quiet place away from ranch business." The move to the ranch house took place in the spring, when the roads were clear enough for wagons loaded with their belongings. The foreman's house, while simple, was nearly twice the size of the cabin, with 3 proper bedrooms, a spacious kitchen, and a covered porch that wrapped around 2 sides. Mrs. Thompson, delighted to have Abigail and the children nearby, helped make the house a home, sharing cuttings from her flower garden and contributing curtains she had sewn herself for the windows. The older woman, childless except for her daughter in California, doted on Grace and Samuel as if they were her own grandchildren. By the summer of 1881, the transition was complete. Gabe was effectively running the ranch, with Mr. Thompson providing guidance but gradually withdrawing from day-to-day operations. Abigail, with Mrs. Thompson's encouragement, had started a small school for the children of the ranch hands and nearby homesteaders, using her Boston education to ensure the next generation would have the basics of reading, writing, and arithmetic. Life was not without its challenges. The territory was still wild in many ways, with occasional tensions between settlers and the remaining Native American populations. Drought threatened the ranch one summer, requiring Gabe to make difficult decisions about cattle and water rights. A fever swept through the community during the winter of 1882, claiming several lives, including that of the old doctor who had delivered both Grace and Samuel. But through it all, the foundation Gabe and Abigail had built remained steady. Their love, kindled on that stormy night when her candle went out and he promised to stay until morning, had grown into something enduring and unshakable. It was the constant in their changing world, the light that guided them through both darkness and dawn. In the spring of 1883, almost exactly 5 years after their first meeting, they made a pilgrimage back to the cabin. Grace, now 4 and full of questions, ran ahead on the trail, her dark curls bouncing with each step. Samuel, a sturdy 2-year-old, rode securely in front of Gabe on his horse, tiny hands gripping the saddle horn with determination. Abigail, 7 months pregnant with their 3rd child, rode the gentle mare Gabe had purchased specifically for her after Samuel's birth. As they approached the clearing where the cabin stood, memories washed over her the fear and wonder of that stormy night, the hope that had blossomed with Gabe's return, the bittersweet joy of their wedding day. The cabin, maintained with occasional visits and basic repairs, looked much as it had when she had first arrived from Boston. The garden had gone wild in places, but still produced some hardy perennials that had survived without tending. "It looks smaller than I remember," Abigail remarked as they dismounted. Gabe smiled, lifting Samuel down before helping Abigail. "Everything seems bigger when you're alone," he replied, his hand lingering protectively at the small of her back. They spent the day showing Grace and Samuel the place where their parents had met, picnicking on the porch and telling stories. As evening approached, Gabe built a fire in the old fireplace while Abigail prepared a simple meal on the stove that had served her so faithfully during those solitary months. After the children were asleep in the bedroom, tucked into the same narrow bed where Abigail had once lain listening to the rain, she and Gabe sat before the fire, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting against him. "You ever think about how different things might have been?" she asked softly. "If there hadn't been a storm that night, if you hadn't seen my light." Gabe was quiet for a moment, contemplating. "I believe some things are meant to be, Abigail. Maybe not in the way folks talk about fate or destiny, but in the way that certain souls are drawn to each other, no matter the circumstances." He placed his hand gently on her rounded belly, smiling as he felt the baby move beneath his touch. "That storm didn't create what's between us. It just gave us the chance to discover it sooner rather than later." Abigail covered his hand with her own. "I'm glad it was sooner," she said, turning her face up to his. Gabe's kiss was as tender as the first they had shared in this very room, yet deepened by the years and experiences that had bound them together since. "As am I," he murmured against her lips. "Every day with you is a blessing I never thought to deserve." As night fell fully and the cabin grew dark save for the firelight, Gabe reached into his pocket and withdrew a small package wrapped in cloth. "I brought something," he said, handing it to Abigail. "Seems fitting given how we met." Unwrapping the cloth, Abigail found a beautiful silver candlestick, more elegant than anything that had ever graced the simple cabin. "It's lovely," she breathed, running her fingers over the intricate patterns etched into the silver. "Turn it over," Gabe urged gently. On the base, she found an inscription. "To my beloved Abigail, whose light guides me home. Forever yours, Gabriel." Tears filled Abigail's eyes as she read the words. "Oh, Gabe." He took her face between his hands, thumbs gently wiping away the tears that spilled down her cheeks. "I promised to stay until morning came," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "But what I didn't know then was that you would become my morning, Abigail. You and our children, you're the dawn that ended a darkness I'd lived in for so long I'd forgotten there could be anything else." Abigail leaned into his touch, her heart too full for words. Outside, the night was clear and star-filled, so different from the storm that had brought them together. But within the cabin, the same essential truth remained that in finding each other, they had both found home. Their daughter Elizabeth Rose arrived in the heat of June, a peaceful baby with Gabe's blonde hair and calm temperament. As their family grew, so did their connections to the land and community around them. The Thompson Ranch, officially transferred to Gabe's ownership when the older couple finally moved to California in 1884, became known as the Lawson Ranch, a place of fair dealing and hard work. Abigail's small school expanded as more families settled in the area, eventually becoming the foundation for the town's first proper schoolhouse. Though she no longer taught regularly after Elizabeth's birth, her passion for education remained evident in the bookshelves that filled their home, and the emphasis placed on learning for all three children. The cabin remained their special retreat, a place they would visit when they needed to reconnect with each other, and the simpler life they had once known. As the children grew old enough to understand, they were told the story of the storm, the candle, and the cowboy who had promised to stay until morning came and then had stayed for a lifetime. Years passed, bringing both joy and sorrow. They lost Mrs. Thompson to age and Mr. Thompson not long after. Grace grew into a thoughtful young woman with her mother's determination and her father's way with horses. Samuel showed an aptitude for ranching that delighted Gabe, while Elizabeth developed Abigail's love of books and learning. Through it all, the bond between Gabe and Abigail only strengthened, tempered by shared struggles and celebrations, by the daily work of loving each other through changes both expected and unforeseen. On the 20th anniversary of their first meeting, they returned once more to the cabin, this time alone. Both in their 40s now, with silver threading Gabe's hair at the temples and laugh lines crinkling the corners of Abigail's eyes, they sat together on the porch as the sun set behind the mountains they both loved. 20 years, Abigail mused, her hand warm in Gabe's. Sometimes it feels like just yesterday that storm blew you to my door. Best detour I ever took, Gabe replied, lifting her hand to press a kiss to her knuckles. Would you do it again, knowing everything, the hard winters, the droughts, all of it? Abigail turned to him, her eyes as clear and direct as they had been when she first opened her door to a drenched cowboy seeking shelter. In a heartbeat, my love. Every moment, good and difficult alike. As darkness fell, they lit the silver candlestick Gabe had given her years before, its flames steady and bright against the gathering night. In its light, they saw reflected all they had built together, a love that had begun with a promise to stay until morning, and had sustained them through all the mornings and evenings since. Outside, a gentle rain began to fall, pattering on the roof with a sound like distant applause. Abigail leaned her head against Gabe's shoulder, feeling the solid strength that had been her constant through the years. I'm glad your candle went out that night, Gabe said softly, his arm tightening around her. Abigail smiled, remembering her initial fear and the leap of faith it had taken to open her door. And I'm glad you were the one who found it in the dark. Together they watched the candle burn, its light a testament to a love kindled in storm and nurtured through seasons of change, a love as enduring as the mountains that had witnessed its beginning, and would stand sentinel over its continuing story for all the days to come.